We are starting. And hello to everyone. Let's see here. I think YouTube will pick up the stream directly. And I want to say hello and welcome to Coffee, Kegs, and Kriegsspiel. I'm your host, Marshall. And yesterday we had our first in-person run of K23 at PolyCon, which was a convention that took place in San Luis Obispo at Cal Poly University in San Luis Obispo, California. The event was attended by about 7 players. It was a pretty small and simple game. However, I gave the players a lot of units. As you may know, K23, I let players build their units. I give them a number of points. Typically, that point value is between 20 and 50 points. I gave the players 80 points apiece. So I had 7 players running around with 80 points worth of blocks and had some pretty cool experiences while I was at it. Let's see here. I just need to minimize that so I can see the audience here, and good. All right. It looks like we had a pretty good game. Everything went very smoothly. I revised the dice for it. I have created what I call the 5-minute die and now the 15-minute die. And in this game that I ran yesterday, the biggest change over previous tests is I ran everything in 15-minute turns. And this was some feedback that I had got repeatedly about K22, but had been resistant to make the change because in K22, players kind of command at a pretty low level, and I figured, well, they would have more command and control. However, it created practical issues with how the system unfolded. Specifically, things just took a long time to develop. So in K23, after some test games, a couple of test games, I decided to break down and go ahead and try 15-minute turns. And I have to say it worked beautifully. It really did. I think it was a very good balance between player command and control over their stuff, plus trying to just get through the game over time. So it worked really, really well. So that's what we did. We did 15-minute turns. I created a pretty simple scenario. The Union was required to protect a rail line here, and that's badly outlined here because of the physics of the table. And if I make it a little bigger, but they were required to protect this, whereas the Confederates were required to basically seize that rail line. The Confederates had the option of coming in wherever they wanted on the west and the south side of the map, whereas the Union was required to defend this position but could set up just about anywhere they wanted. They set up pretty far forward out here on both sides, and then I think over here they also set up. So they had some pretty decent defenses based on where the enemy was likely to approach. And that's when the Confederates, in deciding where they wanted to come in, made their first mistakes. They actually made about 3 key mistakes right from the opening that certainly made it harder for them to win. The first mistake was they placed their officers at the back of the column with their artillery. So they've got artillery and they've got their command elements at the very rear of the column. And as you know, I'm a big... I don't like that. I don't have any command blocks here, but I don't like that. And the reason is very simple, is if you encounter an enemy and you need to attack them, your artillery is at the rear of your column. It's going to take 15 to 30 minutes to get it up and get it deployed. This is why if you are expecting contact with an enemy, you always deploy artillery, usually as the second or third element in your movement column, as the second or third movement element in your column. Usually you'll have some sort of cavalry or a skirmish element or something out in front to guard against any kind of sudden attack or ambush, but then you have your artillery right there because you need that to push away the enemy. You also need the person who's making the decisions up at the front of the column, so that they can see what's going on and make the right call. If you're at the rear of the column and you're relying on couriers to bring you dispatches from the front of the column, which could be a mile to your front, again, that's going to take 15 to 30 minutes for you to even create a coherent reaction to the threat. And so you're basically surrendering a lot of command and control. The other error that they made is they were attacking while outnumbered. Now, that wasn't their fault because that was the scenario. The problem is they came in on three pretty diverse axes. In other words, there was a lot of distance between them. And the thing is, when you are outnumbered by an enemy, you have to do what Napoleon did, which is you're looking for an opportunity to defeat the enemy in detail. So they learned this from me after the battle, of course, because experience is a hard teacher. You get the lesson after the test. But here's the enemy positions here, here, and here. And what you don't want to do is come in on, have a third of your force coming in way over here where these other two columns cannot support it. But when you do that, the problem is these units here are hitting enemies that are pretty much of similar strength and composition. Initially, these were cavalry units, but back here, they had a pretty good defensive line set up like this, with units that were at least of equal strength as these that were attacking. And so what ends up happening is they drive off the cavalry, which is fine, but they end up dealing with units here that are of equal strength and in a better defensive position. And they cannot break through because they cannot overwhelm them, they cannot flank them. So they're in a losing situation there. And what they then need is they need another column to come up and essentially flank or overwhelm the enemy, which of course they don't have. Meanwhile, the Union has their reserves, which initially they actually send this way. And it was a timely maneuver because this column was successful in driving back this line, and then the reinforcements were able to come up. And that's one of the big things about the K23 system is just like in history, you need to have reserves, you need to have reinforcements, you need to use teamwork. Otherwise, the enemy's just going to punch through your line. If you do what we call the IKS meme line, where, we have players who just form these big, long lines. They deploy everything into one line. They have no reserves. There's no teammate around. They're just sitting there in one line. Well, of course, if the enemy is smart or lucky, they will punch through that line, and you no longer have a defense. You break down. So what ends up happening is ultimately this attack here does get repulsed by the reserves, and now there is really no hope left for the Confederates, who ultimately have to fall back. And they chose a fallback position somewhere around here, and I said to their commander, I'm like, what are you going to do next? Because, you know that they're going to attack you. What do you do next? And he basically confessed that, look, ideally, yes, I would fall back, but because we're playing a game, I kind of stand and fight to the end, which is how a lot of people approach Kriegsspiel as a game when it's really a training exercise. But I heard from him what I wanted to hear, which is that the correct response is to withdraw your force and, live to fight another day. And that was ultimately what ended up happening. So with the Union outnumbering them, they really needed to come up with like 2 columns along one road and maybe 1 column along another. And then they could have busted through here or overwhelmed or outflanked or something here. And then they could have drove on the main objective while concentrated while these guys are trying to sort themselves out. But unfortunately, that wasn't the choice that they made. Even then, even had they played correctly according to the strategy that I've suggested here, it isn't entirely certain that they would have been victorious. Again, because they were outnumbered, because the Union had the defensive terrain, they were able to set up and choose where they wanted to fight. It's probably unlikely that the Confederates would have won anyway. But the real test was, do you concentrate your forces and look for that defeat in detail, or do you, spread out across the whole terrain and just kind of come in wherever piecemeal? And unfortunately, they chose that latter path. So that was basically the end of that. But as far as the system goes, the system held up very, very well. The revised 15-minute die, which has reduced the outlier results, worked really, really well. I was quite pleased with it. We actually had a number of middle results, but the idea is the units remained engaged. And at one point, the Union forces, which were momentarily overwhelmed at certain sectors of the line, actually held out. So, they did very well. The system worked. It felt realistic. Um, you know, Everything went very, very smoothly. One of the problems that I had, of course, was the cavalry. And it's not that the system portrays cavalry poorly. It's that when you have cavalry units, players get really squirrely. And that's something that I'm always struggling with, is players not using cavalry correctly. They want to use it as sort of a shock force, which is how you would use it in Napoleonic warfare, but you don't use it that way in the American Civil War. In the American Civil War, it's really more for scouting, and yes, you do make attacks with it, but usually against an enemy who is routed or an enemy who is particularly vulnerable or something. Otherwise, it really is a scouting force. It is there to protect the flanks of your army. It is there to quickly respond to threats or to breakthroughs or something, but it is not really a shock force. It is not the arm of decision as it would be in Napoleonic warfare. So that was one of the things. Eventually, I ended up eliminating the cavalry because they would charge in and do things with it. I just removed them as spent units. And by removing the cavalry from the scenario became a lot easier to manage and run. So I felt that giving the players cavalry was probably a mistake. I allowed them to have it because they were operating over a wide area, but they really pushed it and had large cavalry formations running around. And, I wasn't really down for, what was it, Custer or Pleasanton, and, Pleasanton versus Stewart kind of thing, well, that's just how that went. So ultimately, the infantry and artillery worked great. The cavalry rules worked fine. It's just, it was a bit squirrely and a bit hard to contain and manage. Otherwise, the entire scenario went very, very well. PolyCon XL is going on today. Anybody on the Central California coast can go and join in. It's got a lot of role-play games, RPGs. That's kind of the focus of it. But I was surprised. When I got there yesterday, there was nobody signed up for the event, and then all of a sudden I had like 7 people within 5 minutes just kind of mob me and say, hey, we want to play. In fact, I had one guy who was just kind of listening to what we were planning, and he actually canceled his sign up for another event to come and stick around and play Kriegsspiel. So I guess the event description went really, really well. And I stole a player from someone, although it wasn't my choice. But there you have it. So all in all, it was a pretty good experience. I am absolutely wiped out from it because I ran around the whole time on my feet from table to table to table. Plus, afterwards, I helped with the barbecue because my friends were there working it. So I did labor. And so I am ultimately pretty exhausted. But anyway, I want to thank you all. I'm going to cut this short today just because I am tired, but I didn't want to let the day go by without a Coffee Kegs Kriegsspiel podcast. The K23 system, I'm going to put some work into it this next week. I have a couple games that I need to update. I'm running my Tournament of Champions and my Battle of Absolute Legends games in the IKS test kitchen. I need to run those 2 games, get them up to speed, and then once I'm done with that, I'll come back to K23 and probably get the system in a publishable ready state by the end of this week. At least that is my goal this coming week, to have that out. So that's how that experience went. I see Achilles just popped into the audience. Good to see you, Achilles. And let's see who is here. This is D. Good to see you, D. Thank you for checking out the podcast, and everybody else who came and went. And it's a short one today because I'm just exhausted. But hey, we will see you all on our next adventure.